nervous. I am a little sick, so.
Yeah, that's all right.
Hopefully this doesn't take 5 takes to get the...
All right.
This is like the more scripted part that I hate. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Bryce Coon and I'm the Director of Education with earthday.org. Today we are joined by Dr. Janet Swim, and she is a professor at Penn State University and a leader in the intersection between the climate crisis and psychology. So today we're going to ask her some questions about her work and teaching. So one of the things we've talked about at Earth Day, which is kind of in the intersection of psychology and the climate crisis, is we believe that climate education could be used as a tool to develop what we like to call green muscle memory. And so we know that individuals are not, the real bear of the climate crisis, and it's going to take, large forces, governments, big businesses to make the changes that need to happen. However, we do know that individual actions are important and add up over time. For me now, grabbing a reusable water bottle when I leave the house is just habit. I don't think about it much. I think, the next step for me would be if I go get a coffee to bring my mug. That's something that, I need to get ingrained into my behavior. What do you think, in terms of psychology, what do you think the role of schools or society in general in demonstrating these behaviors, maybe through observational learning, could impact people's behaviors?
I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to just comment on your observation and your discussion of the green muscle memory, because I think it's a really nice analogy, which is helpful. And so I would connect it to this research on habit and habit discontinuity. How do we change habits? So one part of that research on changing habits is there are points in people's lives where you're more able to change habits than others. So you move to a new place, and then now you have to decide, how am I going to transport myself from one place to another? Where am I going to buy things? And so those are the points where behavior change can happen, is in these points of discontinuity. And that's pretty extreme to move one place to another. But for teachers, you've got students coming into the classroom. And so the beginning of the semester is actually a really important time to be setting up habits. And to do the habits for the environment is to remind people of the value. So remind kids of nature and how they value nature. And so that's why you're doing it. And so it directs the decision point towards something that's better for nature. So it's getting that habit discontinuity. And then the other thing you said was like water bottles to coffee mugs. And that's what we might call behavioral spillover. So you go from one behavior to another behavior. And it's easiest to do that when the behaviors are similar to each other. I think that's why you thought of that. You're drinking out of one thing, you drink out of something else, and you spill it. Right. And so those are points of opportunity for change. But we also want people to spill over to things that are not similar. And so when people are doing something, is to have them start identifying themselves as, I'm an environmentalist for doing this, or I care about nature for doing this. I'm doing this because I value nature. And when you start incorporating that part into your identity, that's going to be more likely for you to be doing it for another behavior, to spill over to something else that might be more distinct.
What advice would you have for K through 12 teachers who want to incorporate more climate change education into their classes, whether it's about the materials or how to address this with their students? Anything that you, in your research or from teaching this, that you've learned?
Well, I was thinking about what we just talked about, in a sense, is finding out what it is that the teacher feels comfortable with. And the teacher should be reaching into what they know and what they could develop. But also, connecting with the students and knowing where their insecurities are, where their securities are, where it's not just, I said insecurities because that's what I started with, but where is their points of passion and connecting with those. So, because I do think there's connections everywhere. But I was going to be sort of more concrete about, like, specifically, I think about building back to the way I started with the two connections of building this broad sense of connection to nature and taking the opportunities to have students care for nature or be mindful. So even teaching people about mindfulness, students taking time to figure out how to be mindful. Being connected to nature is part of systems thinking. You're part of a larger web of life. But systems thinking also is knowing pathways. So I'll give an example. I was talking to somebody about water, and they were saying they're trying to use less water. And so I asked them why. Why do you want to use less water? And it was more like, well, that's the right thing to do. But she didn't know why. And so part of the why, I was just illustrating one thing, is that the more water you use, it goes down your drain. It goes into the water treatment plant. They use energy to create and clean. So they use energy to clean the water. And so it actually, using less water can contribute to decreasing climate change if your water treatment plant is run with fossil fuel energy to clean it. And so that to know where your water goes, and then where your water goes and what you put in your water matters, because your water goes through the soils if you have a septic system, that a private septic system. And so we found with our research that if we tell people about a policy where we want people to upgrade their septic systems, and if we explain to them it's because the water goes into the ground, and the ground filters through, goes into the groundwater, goes into the rivers and lakes, and showing that pathway, they actually feel more hopeful about the policy, and they're more likely to support the policy. So teachers can help people see that. One exercise I've seen somebody do is have students draw what they think, where their water comes from and where it goes to. And people don't know, right? And students don't know, and teachers might not either. They might need to figure that out. But if you can have people, lay out those systems.
It comes from the faucet.
Yeah, right. You turn it on, it comes out, right?
Goes down the drain.
Yeah, it comes from somewhere. I don't know how it gets there, but they don't necessarily put in the treatment plants, and they don't put in. It goes through, like what came out, it went through nature, and it goes in.
No, I remember learning that because, when I was younger, I had that same idea, and I was thinking, at the time I was living in Michigan, which would not be a place with water scarcity. And I was thinking, I'm using this water, and if I water my lawn, which I didn't have a lawn at the time, I was a kid, but if I water the lawn, like, that water is going into the groundwater or it's being evaporated. Mm-hmm. It's what's wrong here, right? And so, it was when someone taught me that, well, no, that water had to go through all this processing to get to that point where it was, you could drink it, it's perfect clean water and everything, that I really made that connection. So the education is a key part.
And I think part of the education, so some education is these individual behaviors, but the other is system change. So what we have had in our area around here is our water treatment plant has put up solar panels. And so the energy that's used to clean the water is now clean energy. But that costs taxpayers some money to do that. And so to have people make that connection to why they need to have solar panels there is also part of creating that whole system, that our water, we can clean it better.
Dr. Swim, could you tell us a little bit more about your work in general?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you. I am pleased to be a part of this, and glad that I can help out. So I'm trained as a social psychologist and migrated over to focusing on environmental and conservation psychology about 10 or 15 years ago. And I think about my work as, going for the better nature for nature, in a sense, our better nature for nature. So I think how people think and feel about nature, and how they think and feel about the solutions that we can use to improve our relationship with nature and the health of nature. And so I look at people's behaviors, their willingness to do different behaviors, talking with other people about climate change, their responses to different sorts of policies that would protect nature. And many of those focus in on climate change and the implications for climate change.
What have you found to be the most significant factors in influencing individuals' connections to the value of nature? And how could schools play a role in fostering this value?
I think that I would probably say this is work with Michael and Giza and Carter Hunt. It's having a meaningful connection with nature. It's having the point where you care about nature. So I remember when I was a kid, I still remember it. It was very striking to me that we went out and planted trees. And to me, it was like, as a kid, it was like, oh, I can make a difference here. And
did you do that on Earth Day? Just say yes.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, nice.
It was probably in the spring, so April was probably a good time. And so it's this caretaking relationship with nature and this meaningful part of it. But it's also being mindful in nature. So paying attention to what's around you and not just glossing it over. It's like having a relationship with somebody. You notice them and you know something about them. And so taking the time to be able to be mindful about what is in front of you, and education can help with that as long as it doesn't objectify nature in that process, but is more about this connection with nature.
In your research or just your thinking about this, do you think about the role of technology? I'm thinking about when I was a classroom teacher and the cell phones, and I even had these experiences that made me very sad, where I would say like, oh, it's a nice day, let's go outside, and I actually had students who didn't want to go outside. It was it was too hot, or it was too cold, or the grass might have moisture on it. So have you found any research about the role of technology or how people are feeling about nature today versus maybe the past? I
haven't particularly researched that, except that we do use phones in some of our studies where we go out and have people take pictures of nature. And so it's taking a picture and what you think is beautiful in nature and using the technology to make a connection. And then as opposed to having the technology separate you from nature. And I do think that is an issue that we tend to protect ourselves from nature rather than embracing nature. And so this idea that my initial thought was like we put on our coats and make sure we're warm, and they're not, like right now in winter, and so we won't get cold or we won't get wet. Because we're not actually going to melt if we get wet, right? And it's a little bit uncomfortable. You recover. So there's some research that people are concerned about being in nature, but once they're there, it's better than what they think it will be. So it's and you might know the affective forecasting research. You forecast. If you don't have a lot of experience with something, you may forecast your emotion correctly, but you might not get the intensity correctly. You may. So yeah, I'll be cold, but it's not going to be as cold as you think. And you can recover from coldness and wetness. And I think that's an important role for teachers to play, both to give people the initial experiences in nature so that they know that these things they do recover and it's not as bad as you think. But teachers themselves need to communicate that. So they need to show that they're embracing nature, that they're not, as soon as you come back in, you don't have to clean nature off yourself, And so it's, you probably do need to be clean, but it's not in a sense of protecting, and a barrier between you and nature. And so teachers would need to enact that as well and communicate that in subtle ways when their kids are out in nature.
I really liked how you talked about the mindfulness and feeling the importance of nature, because I feel like sometimes that part is left out. And especially for young people, I think that's really important because, we'll talk about the causes of the climate crisis and how we need to solve it. And maybe it's just me, but it seems sometimes like the why is kind of glossed over. And so, that's one of the reasons, I'm really passionate about biodiversity. And, when you learn about all the species that are under, these beautiful species that are, under threat, you're like, this is why we need to do something.
So that reminds me back again when you asked about what my students come into. I have asked them like a why. And the basic thing they come back with initially is that, well, we get food from nature. It's all about what we got from nature. And we get that, it's called ecosystem services. And so the services that nature gives to us. And that's, people understand that, but I want to take them to the relationship they have with nature. So I was actually at a meeting, it was a UN meeting, and they were talking about the words that should be put into the UN IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. So this big international report. And one of the words was ecosystem services. And the scientists wanted to put in ecosystem services because that's the way they thought about nature giving it. We need nature. It's not like we actually need clean water. It's not something to say that we don't need the services is silly, right? But the person in front of me was from Argentina, and I kept hearing them say Pachamama, and I come to I may have pronounced that wrong, and I apologize if that's true, but I've come to understand it's like Mother Nature. And they were upset that the scientists would talk about nature as if you were getting things from your mother, and the only valuable reason that your mother's only valuable for the things that she gives you. And so she was saying, they were just like, no, it's Mother Nature. We have a relationship with nature. And so there was a tension in writing that, but it instead start making me think about, this relationship part of nature. That nature's a community. We're all in a community together.
Yeah. And that connects back to your social psychology and the importance of considering culture when we have these conversations.
Right. Yeah.
One question I want to ask you, maybe final question, would be, I was reading one of your papers about looking at the importance of hope and climate engagement. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about your findings from that research and the role of hope in the climate crisis, and maybe especially for young people, since we think so much about climate education at Earth Day.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think about hope in two different ways. And one is a sense of a broad sense of hope, and another is hope specifically about what you might like to do. So a broad sense of hope might be inspiring, and that's important for engaging people in the topic area. But you need to be, what we talk about in the paper that you're referencing, I believe, is that it's hope about the specific thing that you want to do. And so if you really want to have people do something in particular, you should be thinking about hope about that thing or that action. And so, and hope, to borrow a cognitive version of hope from a person named Snyder, is both having the will and the way to do something. So you have to want to do it, but you also have to perceive that there's a way to do it and what strategies you can do it. It's quite similar to efficacy. It's and to be able to understand why it is what you're doing matters. So that's when I mentioned to you at some point that systems thinking, that to be able to understand the connection between your action and the outcome that you want. So it's building hope specifically about a particular action. And so if you have general hope, that might lead you to want to do something, but it doesn't necessarily lead you to do anything in particular. So that's one of the points of that paper.
Do you think we're doing a good job facilitating hope among young people today in regards to the climate crisis?
That's a really good question. So I think, I don't really know. I know that there's a fair amount of worry, and you can be worried and hopeful at the same time. So just being worried doesn't mean that you've excluded hope. I don't know that we have done a great job for young people or people in general about specific hope. I don't know that people really know sufficiently about what it is that they can do and the things that they can do that are effective and how to go about doing it. Because it's complicated to do things, and it takes working with other people to do it. It takes challenging your what you typically do, but the hope part of it is seeing that when you do it, it's not just sacrifice. You actually get something out of it, and so just to be inspired by what it is that you're going to do, and it's not a sacrifice. It actually builds. Builds yourself, builds other people, builds the environment.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us, everyone who came to watch this great interview. And I want to thank Dr. Janet Swim one more time for this amazing conversation and sharing her research and teaching with us. It was very meaningful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.